There we go. Now we're recording, so just remember. And also as a reminder, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them at the end. That is one of the difficulties when you're trying to do a talk in person and Zoom, is trying to bounce back. So if you have a question, just share it in the chat and we'll try to get that at the end. This is your microphone.
Oh, okay. Is that good? Somewhere like that? That'll work. Okay, we ready to roll? Okay, great to see everybody this afternoon. It's nice to have a full house and new faces and lots of familiar faces too. That's great. What? And let's try again. There you go. I think of ferns as kind of the filler of the plant world. They soften the edges of boulders and stone walls and the base of trees and decorate meadows. But they are far more than decorative. Ferns are a fascinating and tough group of plants with a history that goes back some 400 million years. Now, among the earliest land plants to evolve, and ferns have kept that ancient form of reproduction by spores that they share with bacteria, fungi, mosses, algae, all reproduced by spores. But unlike that group, ferns and their relatives have vascular conducting tissue. So that makes them closer to being like the seed plants. Now, until recently, ferns and club mosses and horsetails were lumped together in a group called pteridophytes, which literally means winged plants. But modern DNA analysis shows that the ferns, that some of these groups are farther apart than we'd originally thought. The lycophytes are the club mosses, fir mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts. Not a whole lot of them in the world, as you can see, and they're lumped together as the lycophytes, while the ferns and the horsetails are lumped together under the manilophytes. And the word monil means necklace, and that's referring to how in some ferns and the spore-bearing parts are kind of lined up like beads in a necklace. So the manilophytes. Now, collectively, the two groups are called cryptogams, which means hidden seeds, as opposed to the phanerogams, the flowering plants, which means visible seed. Now, most of my talk is going to concentrate on ferns only. I'm not going to get into horsetails and club mosses today. And I'm going to particularly concentrate on ferns that you can see in the North Carolina Piedmont and ferns that you can put in your gardens. Now, it took people into the 1800s, actually the late 1800s, to figure out how ferns reproduce. It was very mysterious. And ferns were considered to be able to confer invisibility if you knew how to collect the right things. If you want to do it, what you have to do is go out at midnight on Midsummer Eve, June 23rd. You have to have a stack of pewter plates, and you put those under the ferns and you collect the fern dust, and that will make you invisible. Well, it was actually Marcello Malpighi. Some of you may have heard of the Malpighian tubules in the excretory system of some insects, some animals. He was the first to describe the dust that came out of ferns. He was seeing the sporangia, and I'll talk more about that later. And that was in the late 1600s. Think about what an exciting time that was. The microscope was invented around 1590. And what a new world it opened up to scientists. I just can't imagine how exciting that must have been. Everybody scurrying to their microscopes and seeing things they had never seen before. Well, about 100 years later, in 1794, there was a British surgeon who lived in Jamaica. His name was John Lindsay. And John Lindsay figured out that the fern dust, which he called duff, or farina, which means meal, he figured out that that was how ferns grew, and he learned how to propagate ferns. He corresponded with Sir Joseph Banks at Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in England, and sent fern duff and instructions on how to grow ferns to Joseph Banks. And that started a fern craze in England. And in fact, every proper Victorian parlor, which obviously this one isn't, but it was close as I could get, every proper Victorian parlor had tons of ferns into the Victorian era. And to this day, Kew Gardens remains the world's largest collection of living ferns. Now, even in modern times, yeah, sorry, Kew Gardens, yep. Now, even to the modern world, the fern reproduction can seem a little mysterious because we don't see a big part of it. The part that most people, the fern plant that most people see is the sporophyte, the plant that produces the spores. And the sporophyte has structures on it called sporangia, where the spores are produced by the process of meiosis. So when the spores are produced by meiosis, each spore usually ends up with one set of chromosomes. And those spores then germinate and form a little structure called a prothallus, which you usually don't see. It's mostly a tiny structure. The prothallus develops eggs in one section of it and sperm in another. The sperm swim to the eggs. A zygote is formed. Now, two sets of chromosomes, usually. I'll talk a little more about fern hybrids later. Two sets of chromosomes, and that, if it lands in the right spot, which is typically nice moist soil, it will grow into a new sporophyte plant. So this is called alternation of generations. It's been boring middle school and high school kids for decades. And it wasn't really until the mid to late 1800s when this was figured out completely. Now, it may take only a few weeks for that zygote to take root and begin to form a young sporophyte. Or if conditions aren't good, it may take years. So all depends on the right conditions. I should note that most ferns are perennial. There is an annual fern in England. Now here's a drawing of the European common rock polypody. And you can see that where the spore-bearing parts form these are called sori. These dots are called sori. Sometimes I've heard them called fruit dots in some of the old books, but that's a bad name because these aren't fruit, like from a flowering plant. And within these sori, the word sorus, by the way, means heap. It's a Greek word for heap. So heaps of spores, you think of. Within these sori, there are sporangia. Now the sporangia are where the spores form. Most spores are only, ferns, like other terrestrial plants, have a problem. How do they disperse their seeds or spores? They can't get up and walk around for the most part. So they have to figure out a way to get them into the air or into the water or carried by birds or whatever. So most spores are one cell only. So they're very, very light. Now, when the spores form in the sporangium, this little stalked structure, the sporangium itself, at some point, the back of the sporangium, you think of this as the stalk, here's the sporangium. The back of the sporangium begins to die out, cells in the back. And that makes the sporangium open a little bit and it leans back. And then all of a sudden the water pressure breaks and boom, out come the spores. So you might think of it as a sneeze. And out come all the spores. Since they're very light, they get in the wind and they can travel for hundreds and hundreds of miles in the wind. And both ferns and club mosses often rely on fungi in the soil. So they form mycorrhizal relationships with fungi in the soil, and that provides nutrients to the developing sporophyte. Now this is a close-up of the sori of Kuntz's maiden fern, which used to be called Thalipteris kuntzii, but it has a new name this week. And you'll notice these orange structures, that's a membrane called an indusium. Often, but not every time, ferns, the sori are covered by a thin membrane that dries up and eventually exposes the sporangia. But you can see the individual sporangia here sticking up out from under the indusium. Now, this particular fern is native farther south of us. It grows in the coastal plain, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. But it has begun to naturalize a little bit and actually has been found in the North Carolina, Piedmont, and coastal plain. It's easy to grow. It gets about 3 feet tall, so it's a fairly large fern for our area. It's easy to grow, but it's an aggressive creeper. So you'd want to know it had that habit. Now I'm going to mention throughout my talk Larry Mellechamp's wonderful book, many of you may have this, The Native Plants of the Southeast, which deals with ferns and aquatic plants and perennials and annuals and trees and shrubs and all kinds of things. It's a wonderful book for growing native plants. I can't recommend it more. And with each plant that he discusses in detail, he gives a 4-star rating. 1 usually means Larry likes the plant a lot, but it's not easy to grow and you can't get it in the nursery trade, so forget about it for the most part. Or you'd have to get it from some special group like the Native Plant Society or the Master Gardeners or something like that. So he gives, and a 4, of course, means it's easy to grow. You can get it pretty easily. It's beautiful. You'll love it. Larry gives the Kunz maiden fern a 3. It's easy to grow. It's handsome, but it's aggressive. So you need to be aware of that particular characteristic. Now, talking about ferns and their spores, one scientist actually calculated how many spores a single fern could produce. He looked at the spinulose wood fern, Dropterus carthusianum, and he took one frond, one leaf of that, and he counted how many sori there were on the leaf. So he counted every one of these things. This is what botanists do when they're bored in the winter. He counted every one of them, and he came up with 7,134 sori. And then he multiplied that by 16 because the number of sporangia per sorus in every source is 16. So he got 114,144 sporangia. And then he multiplied that by 64, which is the typical number of spores in each sporangium. And he came up with a total of 7,305,216 spores that one leaf of this wood fern could produce. So that gives you an idea of how many spores a single fern can produce, but it also gives you an idea of how few of those spores land in the right place and actually develop into a sporophyte, into the fern we see. Now, both ferns and club mosses, some of them can reproduce by bulblets as well. So this is a vegetative form of reproduction. This is the bulblet bladder fern, which is not common in the North Carolina Piedmont. Larry doesn't like this much. He doesn't even give it a single star. He mentions it because he thinks it gets too weedy. And what happens is those little bulbs fall off, they hit bare soil, and they begin to form roots, and up comes a new sporophyte plant, a new fern plant. So vegetative reproduction. Other ferns, about 5% of the ferns worldwide can produce bulblets like that. Now, ferns can also grow by buds underground and with rhizomes and stolons like this ostrich fern that you see here. And it can form big colonies due to these rhizomes. Now, like the Kunz maiden fern, the ostrich fern is not native to North Carolina. It's native farther north and west. But also like the maiden fern, it's easy to grow. It's a handsome fern, but it's a rampant creeper. So if you plant this, you need to know what you're doing. We have this at the Emily Allen Wildflower Preserve, and we have to control it all the time because it's just always going all over the place, and we can't have that. But it is a beautiful fern. Epiphytic ferns typically form buds and on their rhizomes and spread that way. Now, I'm going to talk some about how to help identify ferns. So it helps if you know some of the terms that relate to fern structure. The whole fern is a leaf. You can talk about the leaf or a frond. Either term works. The area, the stalk below the leafy part is called the stipe, or you can call it a petiole. The part within the leafy part, the stalk, is called a rachis, which means backbone or axis. And then depending on the fern itself, and I'll talk more about that, the fern may be divided into pinnules or the leaflets, and they may be further divided into subleaflets and then pinnulets. And we'll get into that more. So those are terms you need to know. Or they may not look like this at all, as I'll show you. And they have roots and scales sometimes and hairs, but we'll get into all of that. Well, there are over 8,000 species of true ferns in the world, 8,100 or so, and they can be confusing, especially when they hybridize, and ferns love to hybridize. I showed you that spinulose wood fern, the Dryopterus group. Oh my, They do it every way. They've got so many chromosomes, sometimes they're polyploidy, all over the place, but we're not going to get into that today. Just, you should be aware that ferns love to hybridize. Now here in North Carolina, there are about 133 species of ferns in the state. 95 of these can be found in the mountains, 76 in the Piedmont, and about 71, this is ferns and club mosses and their allies, this is all of that group, and 71 in the coastal plain. Now, some of those overlap. So if you're trying to get 133 out of the numbers I just gave you, you might be going, huh? No, it's because some ferns are in every region, like cinnamon fern is in every region. Other ferns like the southern maidenhair fern is only in the coastal plain and a very small area there. So some are very rare, some are quite common. And there are also some 15 non-native species of ferns that are naturalizing in North Carolina. Now, let's begin to look at where ferns grow and how to begin to differentiate among them. First thing you want to think is habitat. Are you in a rainforest, like where you might see tree ferns, like in New Zealand? Or are you in the Sonoran Desert, like this lip fern here? So very dry, very moist habitat. Or maybe the fern isn't a terrestrial fern at all. Maybe it's an aquatic fern, like this water spangle, Salvinia molesta, which is actually a serious invasive plant in parts of the South. And it does grow in North Carolina, unfortunately. It's rare in the North Carolina Piedmont, a Brazil native. Or maybe it's an epiphyte and grows on trees like this kidney fern, which is growing on a tree in New Zealand. Does a fern like sun? Well, some ferns can tolerate quite a bit of sun. More of them we think of needing some shade or a lot of shade. Does it like grow best in acidic soils or alkaline soils or neutral soils, or does it not give a hoot what kind of soil it is? It can grow in a lot of conditions. Some ferns are very flexible that way. Growth habit is something that will help you understand ferns. Is it a neat clumper like this Christmas fern here? Neat, forms nice clumps, easy to grow, common in the North Carolina Piedmont. Larry Mellichamp gives us a 4. You probably all know Christmas fern, or I imagine you all know Christmas fern. Or is it like this New York fern, which is not a clumper, as you can see. It's a spreader. It forms big colonies, and you'd want to know that if you put it in your garden. It's a pretty fern, kind of a nice feathery look to it. It's easy to grow, common here in the Piedmont, but it's a spreader. So Larry gives us a 3 because of that spreading habit. Or maybe it climbs like the Hartford or climbing fern, which is rare in the North Carolina Piedmont, a little more common in the mountains, but nowhere is it common in the state. So it's a viney fern. Or maybe it really climbs like this Japanese climbing fern, serious invasive pest. This climbs, as you can see, right up into trees. If this gets in a longleaf pine forest, for example, longleaf pines are adapted to fire. They need fire to open up their cones. But when a fire occurs, it's typically the understory that burns and the crowns of the trees don't burn. Well, look at what Japanese climbing fern does. It grows right up the trunks, and if there's a fire, it funnels that fire right up to the canopy and kills the trees. So timber growers, foresters, people who grow timber, citrus growers in Florida, this is a bigger problem deeper south. They hate this new fern, and unfortunately it is in North Carolina now. Well, what's the size of the plant? That's another thing that will help you begin to look at the ferns. Is it very low growing, like this walking fern, or like this least moonwort? Now, the walking fern is rare in the Piedmont, more common in the mountains, although it's not common in the mountains. I have seen it carpet a hillside in the Nantahala forest. So it can really spread, but around here it doesn't do that. The least moonwort grows, it's very rare fern in North Carolina, and grows in spruce fir areas and hardwood forests in the high mountains and on grassy balds. And in fact, we found this one. It was a group with the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, which was sent out to look for this in the Roan Mountain area. And we were trying to see if that population, which had been there 10 years before, was still around. So there were a bunch of us crawling around on our hands and knees in a grassy bald, party in the grasses to find this little fern. We found it, yay. Now, most ferns in our area are of intermediate height. They're not really low to the ground. They're not this tall. They're, maybe up to 3 feet tall or so. This is netted chain fern, common in North Carolina, Piedmont, in damp situations. It's easy to grow. It is a spreader, but if you have it in your garden and you don't overwater it, it won't spread aggressively. Or maybe, and Larry gives this one a 3, or maybe it's like the silvery spleenwort, very beautiful fern, uncommon in the North Carolina Piedmont, but also easy to grow, according to Larry Mellichamp. He gives this one a 4. So most ferns that we have around here are in this intermediate category. So we don't have tree ferns, so we can't talk about ferns that are that tall. Or maybe it gets pretty tall, like the cinnamon fern and the interrupted fern. Cinnamon fern, common fern in the Piedmont. It's a clumper, beautiful fern to grow and easy. Larry gives us a 4. Interrupted fern, rare in the North Carolina Piedmont, really much more common farther north and west of North Carolina. It doesn't like it here. It doesn't like our heat and our drought and alternate, one day we're dry as a bone and the next day it's pouring rain. It's not happy with that. But both of these can grow 5 feet high. In Rhode Island, both of these were common roadside ferns, roadside ditch ferns. So they can get as tall as I am. Now, another tall fern here is the bracken fern, Pteridium. And it's one of our tallest and coarsest ferns. It's a fern that comes in quickly into disturbed areas, often sometimes grows in pastures, so farmers or livestock managers don't particularly care for it. There's a lot of bracken right now at Pilot Mountain because of the fires that happened several years ago, because this moves in quickly and colonizes. Now, the ability of ferns to quickly move into an area and colonize was really important around 66 million years ago or so. And it was at that point when an asteroid, which is some 6 miles across, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, created a crater of about 110 miles across. As it came into the atmosphere, it flung off, pieces of it were flung off, flaming pieces of it were flung off, caused fires all over the planet. Dust, smoke, ash filled the air. Photosynthesis couldn't happen. Sunlight couldn't get through. So if photosynthesis can't happen, then food webs break down that are based on plants. Almost all the marine plankton died out at that point, went extinct at that point. 70% of the world's species went extinct during this time. And of course, what's the most famous thing that went extinct during this time? The dinosaurs. Okay, so we do have charismatic megafauna there. Yes, the dinosaurs went extinct. The thing I think it's important to remember, however, is the timing of this. The dinosaurs went extinct during this period at a rate of about 1 species every 1,000 years. Scientists believe that we're now losing species at a rate of about 1 species every 30 minutes. So what went on in the Cretaceous was a massive extinction spasm, but what's happening now, in the hour we spend together, 2 species will be gone from the planet. And that's probably a conservative estimate. So that's what has people, so scientists and other people, so worried about global climate change. It's because it's happening so rapidly at an absolutely unprecedented rate. Now, the interesting thing for us about ferns is that you can see a layer of dust and ash in the geological record when this event happened. And after this event happened, ferns had a big spike in their numbers. Prior to this event, about 15 to 30% of the microfossil count of pollen and fern spores, the ferns accounted for about 15 to 30% of that count of the pollen and spores. After this event, fern spores accounted for about 99% of that layer of pollen and spores. So ferns moved in very quickly, colonized, and helped prepare the land for the seed plants to move back in. So they were very important. Now, bracken is common in the North Carolina Piedmont, and it's also an edible fern. You can take that new growth typically cut off the, break off the fiddlehead, rub the hairs off the stem and boil it up. But you do need to cook it. I have seen some recipes that say eat it raw. I wouldn't do that. The mature fronds are toxic to cattle. It produces a compound when it's raw that interferes with vitamin B1, thiamine metabolism. And it's believed to have at least 3 carcinogens in it. Where this is eaten heavily in some parts of the world, stomach cancer is a particular problem that's associated with eating bracken. And it can have neurological effects. So bracken has a you get the point, don't eat it. Bracken has a global distribution. The genus is not a big one, Pteridium is the genus. The one in New Zealand is part of the image of New Zealand. If you go to New Zealand, you'll see the fiddlehead image from bracken all over the place. And that's because the old time Maori used bracken rhizomes as a survival food. So habitat, growth, soil type, growth habit, height, all important characteristics if you're going to learn to identify plants. But remember, the plants don't read the books. Things can pop up in really odd places where you think, I wouldn't expect that to grow here. That interrupted fern, for example, height can be extremely variable. Interrupted fern, like I said, I've seen it this tall. At the Emily Allen Preserve, we have an interrupted fern. It's about that high. It's not a happy plant. It doesn't like it in the Piedmont, and whatever we seem to be able to do to it. So the height, like with so many things, can vary drastically depending on growth conditions. Okay, so here's some other things you want to look at when you're identifying ferns. What's the shape of the frond? Maybe it has a nice triangular shape, like this broad beech fern, where the longest penny are at or near the base of the frond. Now, this broad beech fern, by the way, is a common North Carolina Piedmont fern, easy to grow, and it spreads especially well if you keep it watered. Larry gives this one a 3, and I know that Sheila Lombardo, which probably many of you know Sheila, she's a wonderful master gardener and member of the Native Plant Society. She uses this as a ground cover, and it makes a beautiful, beautiful ground cover. Well, maybe the shape is not a perfect triangle, but semi-tapered, longest penny in the middle of the leaf, the frond. They get shorter up near the top and somewhat shorter near the bottom, like this. So this is called a semi-tapered fern, like this marsh fern. Marsh fern grows in wet places in the Piedmont. It's also common. Or maybe it's really tapered. So we say this is tapered at both ends. Look how short the penny get on this New York fern as you get near the base of the frond, and very, very short near the top. The same with the ostrich fern. Tiny leaflets near the base, very short at the top. Now, some people remember New York fern, that it's tapered at both ends by saying, okay, if you go to New York City, you stay up late at night, you do all kinds of cool things, you spend all your money, you burn your candle at both ends. New York fern is tapered at both ends. So anything that helps you remember is good. Ostrich fern, by the way, is our other edible fern. And it's what people often call the fiddlehead fern. Of course, it produces beautiful fiddleheads, and they are edible. You can cook them up. They have to be boiled or steamed for appropriate amount of time too. But again, the term fiddlehead is just the term for the new growth of many ferns. It's not a specific fern, just like there's no such thing as a chicken hawk. There are hawks that like chickens, but there's no chicken hawk. But some ferns don't look like what most people think of as ferns at all. Like this adder's tongue fern, that leaf is maybe about that big, 3 to 4 inches, maybe at the most. Uncommon here in the Piedmont, but also very easily overlooked. It grows naturally at the Emily Allen Wildflower Preserve. And I've seen it on the River Bluff Trail at Hanging Rock State Park, but it's very easy to walk right by this one. It's not one of your charismatic mega ferns by any means. Walking fern, also, as I've said before, low growing, unique shape. It has kind of a eared or heart-shaped base. And then the frond becomes the tip of the frond gets very narrow and elongated. This fern is cool. Those tips of it go down to the soil and it roots, the tips root, and then it forms a new leaf and another leaf, so it walks all over the place. So that's why it's called walking fern. This fern, by the way, is one of the rarest ferns in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has very acidic soils, so we have very few of the sweeter soil-loving plants. There's one outcrop in Rhode Island with 1 or 2 plants of walking fern on it. It's where botanists go to pray, basically. Let me get a little water here. Okay, so some have unique shapes. Color can sometimes be a little bit of help in identifying things, like this broad beach fern, which has a bright green color, or the lady fern, the southern lady fern, which has a dull aspect to it. Lady fern is another common Piedmont fern. It's a clumper, it's easy to grow. Larry Melichat gives us a 4 because it's a very lovely fern, and it's somewhat drought tolerant, which is very helpful here in the Piedmont. Well, some ferns may have thick, leathery, shiny leaves. Anytime you see thick, leathery, and shiny, you're probably talking about something that's evergreen and can withstand winter, because waxy coatings, thick and leatheriness is a way to keep moisture in plants during times of the year when they're moisture stressed, which is typical when the ground is frozen. Plants aren't getting a lot of water. So you can see this Christmas fern is quite happy, even in the snow. The southern maidenhair fern, on the other hand, very thin, not waxy, shiny leaf, delicate. It dies back in the winter. It's a very beautiful fern too, by the way, and also easy to grow. Native to North Carolina coastal plain and farther south and west. Tolerant of a broad range of soils and quite beautiful. Larry gives this one a 4. Well, now you will often see when you're looking at ferns, fern books talking about once cut, twice cut, or thrice cut ferns. So let's look at what that means. And that's referring to how many divisions the frond has. Is the frond divided into pinnae? So here's a whole frond divided into individual pinnae, but that's as far as it goes. It's not cut any farther than that. Christmas fern, same thing. Here's a pinna, and you notice there's a little tiny stalk there at the tip. So if it's going to be a once cut, it needs to be cut all the way to the rachis, all the way. So like a little leaf on there. So that's the one cut fern. And again, these are all pinnate ferns. Other ferns are not pinnate. So this is glade fern, which is another very beautiful fern. It's not common in North Carolina, anywhere in North Carolina, more common to our north and west, but easy to grow. It's a clumper, but it can form big colonies too. Larry gives us one a 4. And Christmas fern, we've already talked about. It gets a 4 too. Well, now sometimes it looks like it's a pinnate fern, a once cut fern, but it's not really quite cut all the way to the rachis. See how that's not quite cut all the way? And this is called pinnatophyid, sort of resembling pinnate. And that's true of our rock, the polypodes. The common rock polypodia is common here in the Piedmont. It's a beautiful fern. You can see it in the wintertime on rock outcrops. It loves crevices of rocks, so it's evergreen. The Appalachian rock fern has recently been split off taxonomically from the rock cap fern. And it's more, as the name implies, more of a mountain plant. Neither of these are easy to grow. Larry gives this a 2, both of these a 2, because they don't grow easily, but they are lovely. Well, then we have bipinnate. So now the pinna, the blade is divided into pinnae, and then the pinnae are divided into pinnules or subleaflets. And you can see with this cinnamon fern what a lovely color it can get in the fall. And similar, the silvery spleenwort, you have a pinna here divided into pinnules. And notice that the division is at least halfway, if not all the way, to the mid vein there, to the midrib. Notice with these two ferns too, because they can look kind of alike, notice that the cinnamon fern almost has a little pointed pinnule, almost comes to a point, whereas the silvery spleenwort has a squarish tip and doesn't form a point. And you also have tripinnate. The leaf divisions are thrice cut. So these are the lacy cut ferns. So you can see here with this hay-scented fern, it's divided into a pinna, pinnule, and then the pinnules are cut again. To make it a thrice cut, needs to be cut at least halfway to the midvein. So southern lady fern, hay-scented fern are both thrice cut ferns, and there are others that are thrice cut too. Now the hay-scented fern I wanted to mention can form really big patches. This is one that you would not want to put in your ordinary garden bed. It would be thrilled, but you would not be because it is such a rampant spreader. And it can tolerate quite a bit of sun. Now, this one is interesting. If you go somewhere where this grows, this is more common in the North Carolina mountains, not here in the Piedmont. You go somewhere it grows and it may just carpet a floor. In fact, that first slide I showed you after the title slide, where it said, ferns are very decorative, that was all hay-scented fern. You see a whole lot of that, and you don't see a lot of saplings and young trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants. That's an indication of heavy deer browse, that there are too many white-tailed deer in the area, because the deer will eat the wildflowers, they'll eat the saplings, but they won't eat the hay-scented fern. Yeah. Okay, and again, some ferns don't have a pinnate shape at all, but a unique shape. We've already looked at the southern adder's tongue fern, which looks like it has a little slug damage here. Just kind of looks like an ordinary leaf, not like a fern at all. Here's a close-up of the Japanese climbing fern, more almost of a palmate kind of shape rather than a pinnate shape. Purple cliff brake, which sort of defies whether it's divided into 3 leaflets or 1 leaflet or 5 leaflets. Very odd shape. This is a fern of sweeter soils, more common in the North Carolina coastal plain, but rare here. Sorry, most common in the mountains, but not common anywhere. Purple cliff brake, and then the curly grass fern. Who'd have thought that was a fern? And that's a very unusual one. We're not even sure it grows in the North Carolina coastal plain. We're not even sure it's native here. But can you see what it's growing with? Sundews. So that's a boggy kind of situation. So it clearly likes boggy kinds of soils. Now, when you get into ferns, you really have to begin to look at the fertile parts. That's crucial. So look at here at these 2 ferns. We've looked at them before, but now let's look at their spore-bearing parts. And you can see that the sori of the hay-scented fern are round. You can see these are beginning to open up out of the indusium. They're round, whereas the southern lady fern has an elongated sorus, or almost sometimes curved sorus. I like to say that hay-scented fern has periods and lady fern has commas. Now look at the Appalachian rock fern. You notice that the sori are large. These are big sori, and they're only on the upper parts of the frond. They're not on the lower parts of the frond. Northern maidenhair fern has spore-bearing parts that actually are tucked under the leaf. So instead of having an indusium, the leaf itself curls around the sporangia as they develop. So that's the northern maidenhair fern. The northern maidenhair fern I haven't mentioned before, but this is uncommon in the North Carolina Piedmont. But if you go up into the mountains and drive along any road where there are steep rock outcrops, it'll be dripping from many of those places up in our mountains. It's absolutely beautiful. Delicate, easy to grow. Larry gives this one a 4. Christmas fern, the sori are packed densely into rows. In fact, its scientific name, polisticum, means many rows, many stitches. So densely packed, and again, like that rock fern, only on the upper portions of the fern frond, not on the lower pinny. Marginal wood fern, one of the Dryopteris, you can see here that the sori develop right on the margins of the pinnule. Makes it a very easy fern to identify when you see that. Now, I haven't talked a lot about the Dryopteris because they don't tend to do overall very well in the Piedmont. They tend to like easy to drain and moisture soils. which they don't get here in the Piedmont. So you can try growing them. They're beautiful. These are the drafters as a group. The wood ferns tend to be nice clumping ferns, handsome. Many of them are evergreen. They're beautiful ferns, but they're happier in the mountains of North Carolina and farther north of here. So they can be difficult to grow here. But of course, not all ferns have their spore-bearing parts on the back of the frond. Look at this cinnamon fern, completely separate fertile frond with a cinnamon color. That's how it gets its name. Or the interrupted fern, where the fertile pinnae interrupt the sterile portions of the frond. I've had people say to me, is that fern sick? It looks like the leaves are drying up in the middle. I said, no, it's doing what comes naturally. Royal fern, very close kin to the cinnamon fern and the interrupted fern. The fertile parts are right at the tips of the frond, up here. Now, royal fern can get 6 feet tall. It loves to have its feet wet. It's happy in a sunny, open, wet area. But it will grow in an ordinary garden. We've got it at the Emily Allen Preserve, and it's not in a wet spot at all. Very beautiful. Sometimes people think this is a flowering plant because the leaf reminds some people of locust plants, but it is a fern. This is one Larry gives 4 stars. Now on the adder's tongue fern, the fertile frond comes right up from where the leaf meets the stalk, and it's elongated and reminded somebody of a snake's tongue, and that's how it got the name adder's tongue fern. And you'll notice the slits in this structure. The structure is called a sporophore in these plants, and these slits open up when the plant is ready to send the spores. The wind blows through that and flings the spores out. A great adaptation. A close relative in the same plant family is the rattlesnake fern, Atripus virginianus. And here are 2 that are often mixed up. These are all in the same family as the adder's tongue fern. Rattlesnake fern tends to come up early in the spring, kind of has a fairly delicate frond. The spore-bearing part comes up right from where the fronds meet. Up comes the spore-bearing part, the sporophore. The cut-leaf grape fern comes up later in the year, sometimes after the rattlesnake fern has died back. The cut-leaf grape fern comes up. It has thick, leathery leaves, and the sporophore comes from from the ground or at the base of the ground. So you've got 2 separate stalks, unlike this one. Cut-leaf grape fern can vary drastically in how cut the leaves are, on how dissected they are. Okay, Larry doesn't give either of these a high rating. They're not easy to grow and probably not easy to find in the nursery tray. So I think he gives them a 2. Well, a few other characteristics we can look at. What's the color of the stipe and the rachis? Excuse me. Sometimes it's pretty distinctive. The lady fern has a reddish purple rachis and stipe. Larry Mellichamp likes to say that's because Southern ladies like to wear their lipstick. The northern maidenhair fern, the stipe, and the rachis can be a shiny, deep purple or black. Very beautiful. Ebony spleenwort has a purplish to brownish rachis and stipe. Haven't talked about ebony spleenwort. It's common here in the Piedmont. Little clumping fern, can get to 2 feet, but rarely does. And it can be grown. Larry gives it a 3. I'm sorry. We're almost done. But it doesn't seem to like to stay in place in the garden. I've put it one place and others have done the same thing. And 2 years later, it's 3 or 4 feet away. Like, how'd you do that? I don't know, but it's a pretty little fern, a nice little delicate fern. Some ferns are very hairy, like this hairy lip fern or woolly lip fern. Others have scales on the stipe or on the fiddleheads, as you can see with this Christmas fern. I've had people say, I tried fiddlehead ferns and they were awful. I think that's the one they tried. It wasn't the edible one. And I imagine it would be pretty awful. Cinnamon fern has, particularly when young, has woolly cinnamon colored hairs on the stipe and the rachis. And also, if you turn the frond over at the axils where the pinnae meet the rachis, little clumps of cinnamon colored hairs. Now, interrupted fern has a frond that looks almost identical to cinnamon fern, but it lacks the woolly hairs in the axils and on the stem. So some people remember that by saying cinnamon fern has hairy legs and hairy armpits. Whatever helps you remember, really. And sometimes the rachis is winged, like with this broad beech fern. So you can see that there's leafy material on the rachis itself. See that? Another one that's winged is the sensitive fern, has leafy material. These two are often confused. Netted chain fern tends to have a shiny leaf, and the margins of the leaves, if you look closely, particularly with a hand lens, are toothed, little sharp teeth. Sensitive fern has lobed pinnae, but not toothed. They don't have little tiny teeth. Also, you notice that if you can see carefully here, the pinnae are alternate from one another in the netted chain fern. They're opposite one another in sensitive fern. But I would hasten to say that opposite and alternate are not great characteristics to use with ferns. You hear those terms all the time: opposite, alternate, whorled, when you're talking about flowering plants, and that's very useful. But ferns, it's not always very useful. With this particular combination, they are useful. Sensitive fern, sensitive fern, I should mention, is another spreader. It likes moist soils. It can form huge patches. It's another one you wouldn't want to put in your ordinary garden because it would be thrilled, but you would not, because you'd be beating back sensitive fern for some time. Sensitive fern also has a separate fertile frond, unlike, and I don't have a picture of that, but unlike the netted chain fern, where the spore-bearing parts are on the back of the frond, sensitive fern has a separate fertile frond. So sensitive fern, Larry gives a 2 because it is such a rampant spreader. Well, there's lots of other things we could talk about, but I think I'll end with one of the coolest ferns, I think, here in the Piedmont, and that's our resurrection fern, which has had a change of name. Some of you may have grown up hearing it called Polypodium polypodioides. Today, it's Pleopeltis bishoiana is the new name. Supposedly common in the North Carolina Piedmont, but I only know one place, which Arlene Thompson showed me, where it grows in Tanglewood, at Tanglewood. That's the only place I know in Forsyth County. If anybody knows where else it grows in Forsyth County, I'd love to hear about it, because I'm always looking up in the trees and not seeing it. I think it's much more common in the eastern part of the Piedmont. Now, this is not one you could grow easily. It's hard to establish. Larry gives it a 2, but I think that's because he likes it, not because it's easy to grow. Okay, so why it's called resurrection fern? Most plants, if they lose 8 to 12% of the free water in them, will die. Resurrection fern can lose as much as 97% and live. So when it gets dry, it curls up. And you can see how the green frond here is the front of the frond, and that silvery looking is the back. And here's a closer look at it. Front, top side of the frond, the underside of the frond. So what it does, it has, so when it dries out, it's essentially like this. If this is the top of the frond, it gets drier and drier and drier and drier and drier and drier and drier, and it curls up and exposes silvery scales that are all on the back of the frond. Those silvery scales are actually dead tissue, but they're connected to the living tissue of the frond by a little stalk that's 4 to 8 cells in length, really tiny. So when it rains, the scales get the rain. That rain water goes down via capillary action through the stalk and into the living tissue, and it resurrects itself. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take any questions. And for those of you on Zoom, I have given my email address here. we do have a handout, and I can send that to those of you on Zoom, send a PDF to you if you just email me. Just be sure and give it the email as lisalgould@gmail.com, because otherwise some poor hapless Lisa Gould gets my email. It happens.
Maybe she's learned Ferns by now.
She may have, and hopefully everybody got the sheet and the handouts from the Native Plant Society too. Any questions? There on the back of the sheet under non-native potentially becoming invasive. Sorry. Well, it's where it is. Well, it's actually at the manor house. There's a tree on the back of the manor house that has resurrection fern, and that's where I've seen it. That's the only place I've seen it in the county, and I'd love to see it somewhere else.
Is there a fern that you would recommend for a hot sunny place?
Hay-scented fern. Yeah, that likes sun and can tolerate some drought, although I don't know how well it would do here in the Piedmont. You don't see it much in the Piedmont.
They attract anything? I mean, generally speaking, is this ferns will bring something else?
You mean wildlife value?
Any
Sure.
insects?
Very little insect damage that I've seen on ferns, although they certainly provide shelter. That's their primary wildlife value, is shelter. You will find birds' nests in them or under them, insects hanging out, but maybe not eating them. And they have had a lot of medicinal uses. People have used ferns for many things, including a number of them are used to expel intestinal worms and things like that, but not big wildlife use except for shelter.
So someone has asked, can you suggest native ferns that provide good ecosystem services for restoration sites? That's it.
Ooh, that's a hard one because it would depend on the site. Whether it was a sunny site or a moist site, ordinary soils, the exposure. I would look at Larry Melichamp's book as a good place to go for that. And also I gave you the handout. May I borrow your handout again? Yeah, Cobb and Farnsworth and Lowe, a field guide to the ferns and their related families. It's in the Peterson Field Guide series. That's another good place to go for information. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
What's a good fern or shady area, but you want it to be a clump? You don't want it to spread.
Right. Well, Christmas fern
Okay.
would be one. Lady fern
Okay.
would be another. Silvery spleenwort might be another. And if you look at that handout, it does talk about these, does give you some of that information. Yeah, sure.
Is American fern the same as bracken fern?
I don't know the term American fern. Do you have a scientific name for it?
No, but I mean,
Yeah, I don't know. Anybody know American fern? I've never heard that term.
well, I think that I'm mistaken, but.
Well, you may not be. There may be, I'm sure there's a fern out there called American fern, but what it is, I've never heard of it.
Right, okay, good, right. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you control that ostrich fern?
Keep beating it back, keep digging it out. Yeah. Yeah. It is a spreader. Oh, you know, you've learned, but you can eat it. That's one of the ones, yes, that we beat back over near where the showy orchis grows.
Yeah.
That's the ostrich fern. Yes, ma'am.
Would there be any reason why you couldn't take a plain old hay-scented fern from the mountain region and try to get the exact plant to grow here? Would there be any, if you've got equal conditions?
You could try it, but equal conditions between the mountains and the Piedmont, because of the weather conditions, they're not going to be equal. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you could grow it here. The main thing is that you'd have to site it properly and be aware that it's better for naturalized areas, not in your garden bed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm having flashbacks that back to my botany courses.
Okay.